Да, хорошо, соединяю. Инди Норманович.
Yeah?
Вас вызывают на второй линии.
Line 2. Okay, thanks, Irina. Hello? What? Wait. Shit. Okay, so if they give up the east, then no more transport can come in. Okay. Well, what if they give up the west? No more artillery support. Okay. Does artillery support equal food? Because they need food. No. Right. Then I think they should give up the east. Yep. Okay. See ya. January 1st, 1943. Yep, 1943. The war, which began in 1939 and in China in 1937, grows ever larger month after month. But you all know this. This series comes out each and every week. 1942 was the darkest year of the war so far. Not just the active fighting, but for the civilians who were murdered, exterminated in occupied territories across Europe and Asia in the millions. Yes, that is where we are. Exterminated in the millions. And now it's 1943. Happy New Year. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week was Christmas, and as it rolled around, the Allies failed in the race to reach Tunis before the rain set in, and their local civilian high commissioner for the region, François Darlan, was assassinated. The Americans launched an offensive aimed at taking Mount Austin on Guadalcanal, and the Japanese opened a new airbase at Munda to help defend it. In the Soviet Union, the Soviet Operation Mars ended in failure, but at both Veliki Luki and Stalingrad, it was anything but failure, as the Axis were surrounded at both. The German Stalingrad relief offensive Operation Winter Storm failed, but the successful Soviet Operation Little Saturn continued, shattering the Italian 8th Army and pushing 200 kilometers into the enemy's rear. One Allied advance ends this week. On the 29th, Bernard Montgomery's Western Libyan advance with the 8th Army is stopped at Buerat. Now, the offensive to the west in Tunisia that stalled on Longstop Hill last week has brought a fair amount of finger-pointing between the Americans and British. And as Rick Atkinson points out in An Army at Dawn, a harsher, toxic tone now seeped into the alliance. Britain had long benefited from American bounty, and only indebtedness breeds contempt quicker than familiarity. British Army references to the Americans as our Italians could be heard for the first time. In spite of these successes of early November in both the west and east of North Africa, morale is at a new low. Operation Torch was supposed to head eastward until it reached Libya and the rear of the Axis forces there. But that's gone up in smoke. There would be no trapping of Rommel's rump army in Libya between Anderson's 1st Army and Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army, now lumbering westward out of Egypt. Rather than crushing Axis forces in the jaws of a vise, the failed Allied strategy gave interior lines to the enemy and all but guaranteed that 4 armies, Anderson and Montgomery, Arnim and Rommel, would slug it out in a campaign of attrition not unlike that on the Western Front a quarter century before. The Allies have a major siege ahead of them, and just by judging from the enemy positions in Tunisia, it is for sure not going to ever be easy to launch any kind of mobile campaign against Fortress Europe. As for the mobile campaigns currently in action in the Soviet Union, the first few days of the week are quiet along the lower Chir River, but that is because the Soviets are preparing for a drive on Tormozin. Soviet 5th Tank Army doesn't really have the force by itself to penetrate Axis defenses here, then nor was there any good reason to do so. To the west, the Southwestern Front's 1st and 3rd Guards and 6th Armies were savaging Italian 8th Army, and their mobile corps were rolling headlong towards Tatsinskaya and Morozovsk on the Germans' vital supply lines, by rail to the lower Chir region and by air to the Stalingrad pocket. If and when those corps reached those supply lines, Axis defenses along the lower Chir would become untenable. 5th Tank goes into action the 27th, and 5th Shock and 2nd Guards armies join in the 29th, attacking to the west across the Don and the Chir. Together, they're trying a massive pincer movement. 5th Tank kicks off its offensive and makes great initial progress, and German Army Group Holit falls back. But the new defensive line stymies the attackers by the end of the 28th. But with 5th Tank once again making no progress, its commander Prokofy Romanenko is out. That evening, Joseph Stalin relieves him of his command, and Markian Popov is in. Vyacheslav Tsvetayev replaces Popov in command of the 5th Shock Army. That army and 2nd Guards then get their offensives going, and by the end of the day, the 29th, both have solid bridgeheads on the western bank of the Don. That night, Andrei Yeremenko's Stalingrad Front is renamed the Southern Front. The 57th, 62nd, and 64th armies are transferred to Konstantin Rokossovsky's Don Front, so all the armies encircling the enemy at Stalingrad are under his command, and all the forces aiming at Kotelnikovo are under Yeremenko's Southern Front. More on this change next week, because there are solid reasons for it. Speaking of Kotelnikovo, on the 26th, Erich von Manstein's failed relief offensive is in full retreat south of the Don. The Soviet 2nd Guards and 51st Armies are near Kotelnikovo. By the 27th, they have encircled it from the north and south, and the 57th Panzer Corps is in trouble. They cannot hold out, and the Soviets take Kotelnikovo the 29th. This is a big catch, one of the linchpins of the Axis defense, and where that relief force was launched from back on the 12th. On the 31st, 5th Shock Army drives southwest from Nizhna Chirskaya and pushes the enemy out of Tormozin. Once Tormozin falls, 5th Shock is transferred from southwestern to the southern front. By 31st of December, it was clear to both sides that the Stavka and the Red Army had won the strategic chess game being played along the Don, Chir, and Aksai rivers for the past 3 weeks. But those rivers are not the only ones the Axis are having trouble on. The 1st Panzer Army withdraws from the Terek River in the Caucasus to avoid being surrounded. Well, Army Group Commander Ewald von Kleist is worried about being cut off entirely if the Soviet advance to the north reaches Rostov. 1st Panzers are supposed to begin withdrawal tomorrow, the 2nd, but this morning, New Year's morn, Ivan Maslenikov's northern group launches vicious attacks on them, particularly by the 44th Army on the flanks of the 3rd Panzer Division, which only has a handful of working tanks anyhow. So they all begin a fighting withdrawal 1 day early to Pyatigorsk and the Kuma River. And by today, north of the Caucasus, the Soviet Little Saturn attacks have, in 2 weeks of fighting, cut a salient 250 kilometers wide by 130 deep into the Axis lines between Army Groups B and Don. The 6th Guards Rifle Corps and 18th Tank Corps are launching attack after attack against Milerovo. For the first part of the week, they have Hans Kreising's Kampfgruppe surrounded, but they manage to open the road leading south midweek, though they do remain and fight. Around the Stalingrad pocket itself, this week is pretty quiet. Well, comparatively. The reason for that is that all the fronts and armies around there are preparing for Operation Ring, which I'll talk about next week. They're just supposed to hold their positions or try to improve them for now. There is some fighting in the city itself, since Alexander Vasilevsky and Stalingrad Front have ordered Vasily Chuikov's 62nd Army to go on the offensive and expand his bridgehead in the city's factory district. So he makes attacks in Spartanovka and near the Mamayev Kurgan. Though this might seem quiet compared to October and November in the city, overall, reports of both sides during the second half of December agreed that the fighting in Stalingrad city was just as brutal and deadly as it had been throughout the fall. But by this time, the Germans were the besieged. There are also the besieged and also the surrounded way up north at Veliki Luki. Major Soviet attacks continue as the week gets going, and on the 27th, the Soviets penetrate southwest of the city and gain ground in the northwest. The next day, they penetrate in the northwest and launch concentrated attacks from the south, taking the strongpoint Stettin. Things are looking grimmer and grimmer for the trapped defenders, though, who mostly cannot be supplied by air because of weather. At 2:55 the 29th, the German radio message goes out. The situation forces the decision to either give up the eastern or the western portion of the city. By giving up the eastern portion, there will no longer be the possibility of landing transport gliders. By giving up the western portion, there will be no more artillery support. Need a decision urgently. Commander Theodor Scherer tells them to hold the west, because that's the only possible place a relief operation can reach. Still, that night 30 tons of supplies are dropped in. But at 8:34 a.m. the 30th, the defenders send out the word that holding the west is no longer possible. It's being completely destroyed by Soviet artillery and rockets. There are no more positions. If the western portion is to be held, then the defenders will be destroyed in 2 days. The eastern portion is still intact. Request decision immediately, because action must be taken today or it will be too late. If 2 parachute companies could still be landed today, with all weapons and flamethrowers, then it can be held longer. Air landings are only possible in the east. At 2:30 that afternoon, the word goes out that the Western Front has collapsed. They only have rations for 2 days. Today, the German relief attack is scheduled by Army Group Commander Gunther von Kluge for the 4th. Although I should be clear, Kluge thinks it pretty unlikely that they can reach Veliki Luki in time. He has, in fact, communicated this to Adolf Hitler and asked that the garrison there be allowed to make an independent breakout. Hitler refused, just as he had refused to grant Paulus's encircled Sixth Army at Stalingrad permission to break out. The defenders at Veliki Luki would hold or die. The Germans are making advances even further north this week, far up in the polar waters of the Barents Sea. They're trying to intercept Allied shipping convoy JW51B. The 30th, Oskar Kummet sets out with pocket battleship Lutzov and heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper and 6 destroyers. The British convoy escorts are in 3 groups: the close escort of 7 destroyers, the close covering escort with 2 light cruisers and 2 destroyers, and there's also the battleship Anson. But that is well at sea and is ordered not to get too close to Norway because of possible German air attacks. On the 31st, Hipper approaches the convoy 3 times and Lutzov twice, but Robert Sherbrooke and the close escort use smoke screens and the threat of torpedoes to keep the enemy at bay. Still, a British destroyer is sunk and another damaged, and Sherbrooke wounded in the face. On Hipper's 3rd approach, the cruisers get untracked, damaging Hipper and sinking a German destroyer. The Germans withdraw. All of the merchant ships reach the USSR undamaged. This action makes Hitler furious, and he not only wants to now focus only on U-boat warfare at sea, he even wants to scrap the German surface fleet. Erich Schrader, who commands the whole Kriegsmarine, resigns his post and is replaced, well, in a month he's replaced, by Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet. Dönitz does prevent the surface fleet from being scrapped, but I do not think we'll see any more actions like this one for quite some time. In the Battle of the Atlantic for December 1942, U-boats sink 60 ships for 330,000 ton. The U-boat cipher Triton is finally broken just before mid-month, though. There are and will continue to be delays before new settings on the machine can be broken, but still, it's a pretty big deal. For the year, Allied shipping losses are 7,790,000 tons total, 80% of that to U-boats. Germany has 212 of them at the moment, even with a 15% shortfall in production. The Japanese are having shipping problems of their own in the waters of the Solomon Islands. Now, today, January 1st, today, they decide they will evacuate Guadalcanal. This decision means losing the Solomon Islands and any chance of control over the approaches to the Antipodes. But they don't have much of a choice. Since August 7th, when the U.S. Marines began landings on Guadalcanal, the Japanese have lost 65 ships and more than 800 planes, and that's not counting personnel. The evacuation is to be gradual, though, and carried out by Raiso Tanaka's Tokyo Express. Japan has sent in over 40,000 men to Guadalcanal, and not that far below 25,000 of them will never leave. Combined Fleet boss Isoroku Yamamoto writes this week, "How splendid the first stage of our operation was. but how unsuccessfully we have fought since the defeat of Midway. On the 31st, Army Chief of Staff Hajime Sugiyama goes to Emperor Hirohito's palace for his permission for retreat. Hirohito calls it regrettable, but there's kind of more than that. Reinforcing the threatened island outposts on their perimeter was draining the reserves of manpower, aircraft, and shipping. Workers might labor night and day in Japan's aircraft manufacturing plants and shipyards, but they were fighting a losing campaign to outproduce the huge industrial capacity of the United States. There could be no way, moreover, to replace the thousands of highly trained naval aviators who had been lost in the great carrier battles at Coral Sea, Midway, and the actions of Guadalcanal. The spear of Japan's military superiority had been blunted by the end of 1942. But there's still loads of fighting in the region, of course. This week, the Japanese are trying to guard their new airbase at Munda, but constant raids by the Cactus Air Force, destroying Zeros both on the ground and in the air, convinced the Japanese that the base is a liability, so they send the planes off to Rabaul. This messes with a plan to resupply 17th Army on Guadalcanal that involves beaching a huge boat with 85 tons of food there under heavy aerial protection. On Guadalcanal itself, the fighting for the Gifu, which began last week, continues. The American assault battalions, however, over the first half of the week, cannot find any gaps or flanks to this impressive Japanese defense system on Mount Austin. But American command insists that Mount Austin be taken. So on the 29th, they find a path to Hill 27, and today launch attacks designed to take it. They reach the southeast slope in the afternoon. Alexander George takes over command of the 132nd Regiment today in a dramatic fashion calculated to restore confidence, to demonstrate to the men of the 132nd the ineffectiveness of Japanese small arms fire against moving targets. Lieutenant Colonel George, garbed only in shorts and a fatigue cap, walked erect, rifle in hand, the length of his lines. Some Japanese cooperated with George by firing repeatedly but vainly at him. And on Papua New Guinea, the 27th, 52 Japanese planes carry out a raid near Buna. 14 are shot down by Allied fighters. The 28th, Japanese troops at Buna are ordered to retire to Girua. They are protected by units which will make flanking attacks on the Americans. But already that evening, American patrols find the bunkers empty. The next day, the Americans are southeast of Buna Mission, cutting off the only road any remaining Japanese can retreat from. And the 30th, the Americans and the Australians prepare to surround the mission. And here are a couple of notes to end the week. On the 28th, Chiang Kai-shek tells American President Franklin Roosevelt that his army will finally be ready to launch an offensive in the spring from Yunnan. But as a prerequisite, the Allies have to beef up naval forces in the Bay of Bengal. 26 in Africa, pro-Vichy French Somaliland surrenders to British and Free French forces. And the week comes to its end, with Axis decisions to withdraw from Guadalcanal and the Caucasus. Axis troops still surrounded at Stalingrad and Veliki Luki, and Axis ships failing in the far north. And of course, the drives on Tormozin, Kotelnikovo, and Milarovo. The Soviets are still taking loads of ground in that whole region. Here's a few words about what they have accomplished lately from David Glantz. By any reckoning, the period from the 16th to 31st of December 1942 was the second most decisive stage of Operation Uranus. Uranus would have achieved virtually nothing without the initial encirclement of 6th Army, and developments during the second half of December settled 6th Army's fate once and for all. The best that can be said of the Germans' questionable planning prior to the 23rd of December is that there was at least a possibility of rescuing a portion of Paulus's army. After the 23rd, even that remote possibility disappeared. And that is all summed up in one succinct sentence. By the end of December 1942, Paulus's 6th Army was clearly doomed. So Hitler wants to focus on the U-boat campaign from now on. And if you want to learn more about the killer tactics of the U-boats, you can click right here for a special episode we did about that. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Aaron Beatty. The Time Ghost Army is what finances all of our productions and what paid for the expansion to our studio and what keeps us free to produce what we like, when we like, and how we like. So to get more of our fantastic content, be like Aaron Beatty and join the army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And a big thanks to our most recently commissioned officers in the Time Ghost Army. Here they are. Do not forget to subscribe to never miss an episode. See you next time.